During that time when they're learning the field work, what tools and equipment are they using?
You could say it ranges from the sort of old school tools to the new school tools. So it's everything from traditional archaeological techniques. So as much as we're a maritime archaeology program, we really are training them in archaeology. And the reality of working in our field is that, especially if you're working in the private sector, you may not be employed entirely as a maritime or an underwater archaeologist. You really need to have skills in both camps. You need to have one foot in the dry and one foot in the wet.
Thank you so much for being here today, Nathan, on another great Fascinated by Shipwrecks podcast. We're so excited to be bringing experts from the maritime archaeology world to teach others all about what goes on in your field. Today with me, as I say, I have Nathan. He's actually Dr. Nathan Richard, and he's a professor at East Carolina University, and he's been there for about 23 years or so. So his career has had him helping others to learn this fascinating field. I appreciate you being here today, Nathan.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate the invite to be on the podcast.
Super. So we'll just dive into the questions here. Of course, I'm very fascinated by your thesis, what you had done, learning about all about ship abandonment, which is a subject that normally doesn't cross most people's paths. So I wondered if you could let us know a little bit about that subject matter and why you chose it.
Sure. Yeah, it is a bit of a niche subject area. Of course, maritime archaeology is sort of best or most known to be the study of shipwrecks, which are ships that are catastrophically lost. The people that are on those ships don't intend for them to wreck. So the degree to which they're deliberate, there's no real deliberate action other than trying to save your life and cargo in the event. So in the 1990s, I was studying at Flinders University in Australia and working with Dr. Mark Staniforth there at the beginning of the Flinders underwater archaeology program. I really had no idea what I was planning on doing for a career. And in one of his classes in undergraduate, I was taken to a place called the Garden Island Ships Graveyard. And it's a place in Port Adelaide with a lot of iron ships just abandoned there, 19th century vessels. And I was just frankly amazed that such a things existed. And so at that point, that was sort of the hook in the mouth. And at that point, I was begging Dr. Staniforth to take me on as an advisee. And I wrote my honours thesis on that ship's graveyard. But the thing about ship's graveyards are that it's kind of the other end of the spectrum. So, so much of what archaeologists do is studying discarded materials, discarded trash. Historical archaeologists are always digging in privies. We're always looking at the things that people used and threw away. And this is kind of the maritime privy in a sense. It's the ships that came to the end of their working life. They weren't inadvertently lost at some premature point. They kind of gotten what's often called nail sick. They became obsolete or unseaworthy or worn out, ready to be replaced by the newer technology. And just like the trash that we throw away every day, the people that own those vessels had to find ways of dealing with what's some pretty difficult material to get rid of. So they often scuttle them deep in the ocean, which means that they're incurring costs to do that. And sometimes places are not really conducive to efficiently towing vessels out and sinking them. So a lot of times these vessels are also just run aground in areas in inner harbors or in some other context. And, really most maritime nations in the world have ships' graveyards of some sort. And so everything from boats, small vessels to very large craft discarded somewhere. And so they're quite common really across the planet.
In modern days, you're recycling a lot of that material, but not necessarily. So I've never really understood where everything goes when a ship is in its graveyard and how they break it up and what they do with those pieces.
Yeah, it's interesting today. I mean, a lot of the most famous shipbreaking areas are now in places like Bangladesh and India, the large cruise liners. And you can look for this stuff online. It's incredible. These very large craft beached at speed in order to be cut into pieces and sort of butchered like an animal would be butchered. They're sort of choice pieces taken, and there's sort of a hierarchy of cost benefit that people are going through to decide how they're broken up. And of course, it's very dangerous and there's environmental concerns and things like that. But really, from the time the first watercraft was built, the discard event is inevitable. Unless it's prematurely lost in a shipwreck, someone's going to have to deal with it. So, people have used vessels for so many different purposes, whether it's ceremonial. There's a ceremonial act in the discard, like a Viking burial, a Viking ship burial, or something else. And of course, the other thing that happens a lot is in the past, in particular, people are very creative with the use of old hulls. So they often adapt them into things like bridges and grain silos, or run them aground and build houses and banks on top of them, and use them for other purposes. So the fascinating thing for me has always been the trends there. Why do people make decisions to do something with one ship and not another, or to tend to abandon and reuse vessels for different purposes at certain points in history and not others?
How many maritime archaeologists would you say are involved in that end of things?
In looking at graveyards, not a lot. I mean, ships' graveyards show up a lot in development. So, in the United States, as an example, there have been surveys of large ships' graveyards because they're often going to be impacted by infrastructure or their environmental risks. So we can look at places like in New York Harbor, you've got Arthur Kill and Kill Van Kull, and really some of the largest ships' graveyards in the world are just vessels stacked together. And so consultants will often have to look at them in the course of considering development. I mean, my interests are more academic, so I'm often going to places where they're not necessarily at risk from development, looking at them from an academic perspective. But they're really everywhere. I mean, we've looked at them. I've looked at them in Australia, in Bermuda, abandoned vessels in Costa Rica, across the United States. They really are everywhere. And I'm lucky enough to work with people up in Mallows Bay too, which is one of America's largest ships' graveyards and part of a national marine sanctuary.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you do at East Carolina University and what the curriculum looks like for people who are interested in studying maritime archaeology.
So I'm the director of the program in Maritime Studies at East Carolina University, and we're a part of the Department of History here. We're in the Department of History for a range of historical reasons. Our program was formed in the 1980s by two prominent scholars, Dr. William Still and Dr. Gordon Watts, who were really well-known historians and archaeologists. They set us up here in Greenville in the early 80s, and we're one of a handful of programs in the United States that have a lot of faculty teaching in maritime studies, so maritime history and nautical archaeology. We bring in a number of students from across America and really internationally each year, and our curriculum looks a bit like this. So students will come into our program and they normally take a historiography course, and they take a theory course, maritime archaeology theory, archaeological theory, and they'll also get trained. Most of the students will get trained as a scientific diver. Within the university system, you need to be a scientific diver, which is sort of, to put it simplistically, a step up from the recreational diving certification. With that done, they move into a second semester and they take a research methods class, and they'll also take electives. And those electives could be anything from a maritime cultural landscapes class to a ship construction class, or a range of maritime history themed offerings. And this is all preparatory because one of the things in our program is we really stress fieldwork. Employers are looking for well-trained field workers, and we've been quite successful in placing students in employment in maritime heritage. And so in the summer, they move into a summer field school, and they're also, all through this time, they're sort of developing a thesis. So our program is only by thesis. Students could work on all kinds of things in their thesis, but they're sort of developing a proposal with one of our faculty members, and they go through that summer field school. And in the fall, they go to another field school usually. We kind of call it an advanced field school. They're given more responsibilities. The work might be more technical. It might be more complex. And so they're kind of on this journey of learning what it takes to be a field worker in maritime archaeology. And then they might finish off their degree coursework at that point. And then from then on out, it's really about completing a thesis. So, 100 to a 200-page document on some original piece of research. So they're essentially writing what appears to be a book in a maritime historical or underwater archaeological area.
And that's over, what, 2 years or something?
Yeah, you can complete our program in 2 years. The challenge for our students is that lots of opportunities emerge. So there is often opportunities, they have to do their own fieldwork. That takes things like permits and funding to deal with, or they will get pulled into faculty research or other additional sort of opportunities. So they might be helping their peers with their fieldwork. Most of our students will take a little bit longer, perhaps 2.5 years. They'll go into a third year. But generally the quality is very high of the thesis that's produced in that process.
During that time when they're learning the field work, what tools and equipment are they using?
You could say it ranges from the sort of old school tools to the new school tools. So it's everything from traditional archaeological techniques. So as much as we're a maritime archaeology program, we really are training them in archaeology. And, the reality of working in our field is that, especially if you're working in the private sector, you may not be employed entirely as a maritime or an underwater archaeologist. You really need to have skills in both camps. You need to have one foot in the dry and one foot in the wet, in other words. So they'll learn tape measure based recording techniques like most archaeologists would, how to actually set up a control point network underwater and record a shipwreck to scale. And of course, there's lots of different techniques that you can use there. They'll learn how to use surveying equipment, things like total stations and RTK positioning systems, and of course, things like GPS, etc. But increasingly, the things that are important are also the high-tech methodologies. And this has been one of the really big changing aspects of our field. It's continuously changing because of the role of technology. Students will normally be exposed to devices like side-scan sonars, magnetometers and gradiometers, multi-beam sonars, and really is a long list. ROVs, sector scanning sonars. It's really a long list. Of course, the other things that are happening these days are techniques like photogrammetry. Computer-based technologies are really revolutionizing how we record sites, or like computer-aided design software for 3D modeling heritage sites of one sort or another. That's one of the really sort of things I love most about this field is there's something for everyone. If you're artistically inclined, there's the artistic elements of doing things like being an artist and drafting artifacts and drafting site plans of archaeological sites. Or if you're really into quantitative and computational side of things, there's opportunities for people to apply physics and biochemistry notions and technologies too. So our field is very interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary.
I wondered if you could just say something about how site formation processes work. Like, what is that all about?
Archaeological site formation is something that's a lot of people study, and there's a lot of different approaches. And of course, we can't really consider every archaeological site to be the same, although there are what we'd call sort of general law-like principles in the processes that guide archaeological site formation. People like me, I'm an adherent to an approach called the behavioral archaeological approach, which is a set of a theoretical framework set by an archaeologist named Michael Schiffer. He would always talk about basically the process of how an archaeological site is formed, really from the time that it's created. This really relates to the notion that someone has an idea and then builds something or creates the artifact or the site that we'll eventually study as an archaeologist. And that kind of lays down all of the prerequisites for how it's eventually deposited in the archaeological record and then is acted upon, right? So once it's in the case of a ship, when it's wrecked, people might interact with it, and that's an archaeological site formation. We'd call it a cultural site formation process, but also the environment's acting upon it. And we'd call that a non-cultural, or sometimes called a natural site formation process. And so a lot of archaeological work is focused on understanding the wreck in the context, whether it's cultural or environmental. And so, a beach wreck that's buried in a beach, that's prone to waves crashing upon it or tidal fluctuation, is going to have a different series of influences acting upon it than a vessel that's very deep, that might be miles underwater. And so there's the mechanical processes and there's the biological processes, the chemical processes, and they're all going to vary according to the environment. So again, this is sort of highlights the opportunities in maritime archaeology to work in interdisciplinary contexts. I'm pretty lucky here in that we have a great biology department at ECU, and I get to work with Dr. Erin Field, and she's a microbiologist. And so one of the really exciting areas that we're working in is the microbiomes of shipwrecks, and the way that microbiology is really one of these areas that's opened up to let us look at how microbial activity might be influencing either the preservation or deterioration of aspects of a shipwreck. Mm-hmm. And then what that means for the long-term historic preservation of it. Can we mitigate that? Can we slow down processes? Or can we encourage other processes that are happening perhaps? That's kind of like the sort of opportunities that have been opened up by things like microbial analysis and DNA analysis as one example.
That's super fascinating. I guess that sort of lends over to the conservation side of archaeological shipwrecks. Like that's a whole other section of maritime archaeology.
Yeah, and we're lucky as well at ECU that we have the Queen Anne's Revenge Lab here. They have a long-term conservation project here on a sort of a satellite building of our campus. And those conservators are trained in that specific area of looking at the appropriate and ethical recovery of material from archaeological sites and then going through the slow process of stabilizing them as you're sort of bringing them from one environment to hopefully a new environment of their display or curation in a museum or something like that.
Can you tell us about your field work at Mallows Bay and what that encompasses? And is that something that you do annually with the students?
As I mentioned before, our program has two field schools we run annually, one in the summer and one in the fall. And most of our students will go through those two field schools, and they're 3 to 4 weeks long in each case. And our faculty run through a rotation. So we work with one another and trade off who's in charge, who's playing sort of like a second fiddle role or a co-PI role. So we'll work all over the world. My colleague Dr. Harris, she took me to Costa Rica, and my colleague Dr. McKinnon took me to Saipan, and my colleague Dr. Raup took me to Kwajalein Atoll. And these were not my research projects, it was theirs, and I was in a support role. Likewise, when it's my turn, they'll come with me to some location. And back in the 1990s, as I mentioned, I was looking at ship's graveyards, and one of the big ship's graveyards, and one of the few instances of someone writing up research at ship's graveyards was the work of Donald Shamet in Maryland at the Mallows Bay ship's graveyard on the Potomac River. Luckily, in 2019, that ship's graveyard was designated a NOAA National Marine Sanctuary. Really soon after that, I was able to go up and have a look at the site. And I've been trying to work there as much as possible because working with the individuals at the NOAA National Marine Sanctuary and also the Maryland Historical Trust has been incredible. The sanctuary itself is a collaboration between NOAA's National Marine Sanctuary System, the Maryland Historical Trust, and Charles County in Maryland. And they're sort of trying to develop this as a maritime heritage site. Actually, they just released a really awesome virtual heritage trail a few days ago that everyone should check out online. Really, since about 2020, I've been taking students up there to look at individual thesis projects focused on things like this archaeological site formation theme, but also working at the site as sort of an experimental site for some of these interdisciplinary ideas about microbes. Again, working with Dr. Field, I have a PhD student, Alison Ropp. She's looking at one of the wrecks in the bay here. There's about 120 vessels from basically the 1920s and 30s that were salvaged through the early 20th century. And she's been looking at some of those to look at wood density changes and microbial components of potential deterioration. But essentially what you have at Mallows Bay is a site that's a mass dumping event, a mass ship dumping event. When the United States entered the First World War, they had a plan to build about 1,000 wooden steamers to carry material to Europe. And so from about 1917 to 1919, they ended up building almost 200 of these vessels of varying types of design, but mostly the same design, a design called the Ferris type ship. They were not very successful. They were actually part of a large shipbuilding program. There was a steel program, a wooden program, and a composite or a concrete program. But about 118 or so of those vessels were dumped in Mallows Bay in the 1920s and salvaged. They were trying to extract all the metal from the wooden ships. So there's sort of this history that Donald Shamet talked about in the 1990s about the sort of the management of this resource of wooden ships as they were trying to take material from them and inject that metal and other material back into the economy. The vessels were salvaged in the 20s and 30s and also in the 40s for the Second World War. So there's kind of a landscape there of this shipbreaking activity as they're reintegrating these ship parts back into the economy. But of course, it's also just essentially a big ship museum. So it's a fantastic opportunity for me to take my students out and teach them about how ships were built in that era.
Is that somewhat similar to what the gold rush ships in California, that sort of massive amount of ships that are just coordinated just in that one area?
The thing that I find fascinating is that the impetus to do this is different. You know, the gold rush, from what I understand of the gold rush, the ships that were abandoned during the gold rush in California, is that those vessels found themselves in port crews abandoned them. And then humans, being the creative creatures that we are, they found a creative way of integrating them or using them, because you couldn't really sail out of port without your crew. It kind of highlights the economic aspect behind ship dumping. In the case of Mallows, it's a little different in that there's still an economic and social and technological aspect to the reasons behind the dumping, but it's a little different in that while there was a shipbuilding program to help the American cause in the war, the Allied cause in the war ends sooner than anticipated, and the vessels are not very good. They have a reputation for being leaky. And so while there was an incredible investment, where they ended up being dumped. I should also say that really the intention of the program was that if these vessels did one successful voyage, they were deemed a success. So they're kind of not being built with quality in mind. They're being built with a very specific wartime purpose. They're trying to essentially build the vessels as fast as Germans could build torpedoes in the First World War. That's sort of one of the stated sort of mottos of the era. At all of these sites, they intersect with human history differently. There's different causes and consequences behind the formation of the sites.
You mentioned being a PI earlier, which is principal investigator. How does somebody raise to that rank? What does a principal investigator do?
Principal investigator is essentially the person that runs the project. In the case of me as an educator here, being a professor in a program, by being the lead instructor, I'm the principal investigator. But it often entails the person who designs and executes the program or the project, designs the methodologies, justifies why we're doing the work, writes the research designs, and is then sort of responsible for making sure that day-to-day operations happen appropriately and that you're doing everything properly, you're doing everything according to the details specified in the permits that you have to get. So the other thing to mention is if we're working in a place like Mallows Bay, we have to apply for and be awarded or receive a permit from the state of Maryland, from the Maryland Historical Trust, because they're managing these resources on behalf of the citizens of Maryland, and really in the case of the National Marine Sanctuary, all Americans. As a PI, if I'm planning a project in North Carolina, I'm applying to state agencies to get permits and that kind of stuff. So you're kind of responsible for the long-term planning processes and then the everyday operation. And then to do it properly, you're going to see this through. So you're sharing your results, disseminating it in some appropriate form. And of course, in the case of academics, it's a publish or perish kind of mentality. And so publishing is the big part of it.
Sometimes you might be principal investigator for several years if you're working on a particular site.
One of the great things about being an academic in this field is you have the opportunity to do what you want to do, to build your own research agenda and to work really. You still have a lot of restrictions. You need to get those permits that I mentioned, but you also need to get the funding to support that. But otherwise, you don't have any constraints on what you can work in. As long as you're working within the legal frameworks and ethically, and you have the funding, the exciting thing is about building your own research questions and seeing the project through.
Yeah, that would be exciting. When you talked earlier about becoming a scientific diver, is that still like a prerequisite for every maritime archaeologist? Because I know some don't work underwater. Do you still need to train that way?
So we still have people coming into our program who don't dive. That might be for a range of reasons. They might have medical conditions that preclude that. They may not want to, but also there's a career path for people that are non-divers. You could imagine that if you want to work in a maritime museum and you want to work with material culture related to maritime heritage, then you may not need to be a scientific diver. Really, a large part of our industry need you to be a scientific diver because you're overseeing projects where there are in situ archaeological sites that are being affected by something, and you need to be in the water looking at it, recording it. At that point, diving skills are really important. And because it's not recreational diving, it's task-loaded diving. It's not like Club Med diving. It's not always warm, clear water that like you see in a lot of glossy magazine pictures of maritime archaeology. It's black water diving, which is something that we specialize in. And we have a diving and water safety office here at ECU that is incredible in the way that they teach our students to essentially navigate black water contexts. So the scientific diving component is really important in the development of a diver to collect data underwater.
Could you mention just a few of the career options? I can imagine there's so many different branches that you could enter.
I think sometimes students worry that if they're going to take up a master's thesis in a particular area, that they get typecast in the area. but that has never really played out that way. Prospective students needn't worry about that. There's a lot of different career paths for our students. It's really very broad. A lot of the employment goes to what we call CRM, cultural resource management, private sector, where you're working for companies in this sort of compliance area. You might be involved in surveys to inspect, to ensure that pipelines won't affect cultural resources if it's in oil and gas, or if they're placing windmills in the ocean. There's a compliance requirement under federal law to make sure that areas are safe for building, that they're not negatively impacting heritage sites. You might end up working as a contractor really for compliance work in relation to an agency like NOAA or BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Outside of that, people will often get jobs on the state level working for government. So an example would be in the state of North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology Branch, which is part of the Office of State Archaeology. And so they deal with potential maritime heritage assets or resources in state waters. But you might also find a job with a federal agency. I've mentioned some of these already: Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, NOAA, the National Park Service. DPAA is another agency that people often find work with. And then there's also maritime museums and museums generally. And then there's also some work in foundations. So we have organizations like the Ocean Foundation and other great not-for-profits that are doing work that intersect with heritage themes too.
Is there anything else you'd like to add or highlight about studying maritime archaeology?
Various people over the years have said that, it's an artistic science or a scientific art. It's any way you look at it, there's something for someone with a particular skill set. So it's quite incredible. I think our students often come into programs thinking it's one thing, and then they find out that it's very broad, and they often change their mind in what they want to do. That's a great thing to witness in our graduate students. Yeah, anyone who's really interested should reach out to the various programs in the United States or internationally. There's a lot of really good programs that train underwater archaeologists and maritime historians.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating episode looking into what it's like to go to school and learn this stuff.
Thanks again for this invitation.
Thank you so much, Nathan.
Lost in time, the wreckage lies, broken masts and shattered pride. In the deep, the answers hide. Echoes of the past call out, whispers from beneath the waves. What secrets do the shadows keep? Do we dare disturb their sleep?